In a world of rapid technological change, it's crucial to consider the unintended consequences of our decisions. The same is true for how we consume news, and ground news helps me avoid living in an echo chamber of my own design. Because if you don't have a balanced news diet, you're essentially trying to assemble your world with only half the blueprint. Ground news combats this by showing you how different outlets cover the same story, and you can see each source's political lean, ownership, and factual reporting track record. By using ground news, you're designing a more comprehensive and balanced news experience. So if you want to build a more well-rounded understanding of current events, check out ground.news. And if you like what you find, use my link in the show notes for a 15% discount on any subscription. You'll be supporting this show and helping your future self stay better informed. And now, on to the episode. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. An optimism about technology's potential to solve critical problems must be tempered by the realization that even our best intentions can lead to unforeseen consequences. So how do we ensure our innovations are not just groundbreaking, but also beneficial for humanity and the planet? Our two guests this week make the case that by understanding how design can both create and break things, we can build a future worth making. Carissa Carter and Scott Doorley are the academic and creative directors at the Stanford D School, where students and professionals from all walks of life go to learn how to use design in order to innovate, solve real-world problems, and create lasting solutions in their given fields and our daily lives. Their new book, Assembling Tomorrow, A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future, is available now. Carissa, Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
We are excited to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I'm glad that it's a pleasure all around. Now, before we get to the why and what of your new book, Assembling Tomorrow, I'd love for you to humor me by answering what may sound like a rather simple question. How do each of you define the word design? Because I think what the average person, myself included, may think of when they think of that word as either a noun or a verb, and what comes to your minds may be entirely different things. So, Carissa, let's start with you.
I think that absolutely everything is designed. So if we're talking about physical products, like a pen that you would hold, like that was designed. There are digital products that were designed. Every app on your phone is full of design. But it's beyond product. It's about the experiences that those products create. It's about the systems that hold them. If you are somebody that lives in a town, you're part of that system, and there are rules and laws that govern how you behave. All of that was designed. And of course, it also includes technologies, like some of the emerging technologies, AI included, that now govern many aspects of our lives, and the data that power them. So I think of design as data, technology, product, experiences, and systems.
That reminds me of one of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes that you're probably familiar with, in which he said, quote, "Life can be so much broader once you discover one simple fact, and that is that everything around you that you call life was made up by people who were no smarter than you, and you can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use," end quote. Sounds kind of like that.
I love that.
Scott, how would you define design?
Everything Carissa said, and that's it. No, I would agree with Carissa, but maybe add just one little thing, which is design is a certain way of bringing things into the world, bringing ideas into the world. Like some people bring ideas into the world through business, and that's about, can I create something viable? Can I create something that, can make money in the world? Other people bring things into the world through engineering, and that's about feasibility. Is it possible to make something? Design is really about desirability, and that has a ton of different dimensions. Is this something that's going to be aesthetically pleasing and usable? That's kind of the old school way of thinking about design that's still very valid. But then also, is it something that should be in the world? Is this going to be desirable to have in the world? The idea of creating things with a design mindset is really about making sure that the things you're creating are desirable for people and the planet.
Reading the book and listening to the two of you talk about it in other discussions, I connected to it as someone with a filmmaking and storytelling background, because it seems like so much of design designing anything is storytelling.
Design is really about bringing things into the world. And as you bring things into the world, it's an act of communication. And as we try to create things, the things that we're imagining, the things that we're thinking about, find their way into the things that we make. And so one of the things we have is a group of ideas we call intangibles. And intangibles are the things that are very hard to see, but are extremely consequential. So one of them is the idea that people have a tendency to drift toward make-believe. And that can be a superpower because we can imagine things that don't exist. We can get excited about a shared story and work toward a shared goal. But also we can kind of make things up. We can fill in the blanks in strange ways. We have conspiracy theories and misunderstandings. And so design is really about putting ideas into the world. And when you're putting an idea into the world, you're telling a story. You're trying to create an idea of what the future can be or a description of what reality is. And that can be very powerful.
About Assembling Tomorrow, the two of you wrote, quote, "This book is about broken things, the good intentions that designed them and the great possibilities lingering amid their cracks. Intentions and consequences don't always align as expected. Good is not always good, and bad is not all bad. Both are hard to predict and see, but if we pay close attention to how our designs may tear things apart and we create with healing in mind from the start, we can assemble a world worth making," end quote. Why did you write this book? And what was the inciting incident that got you started? Carissa, let's start with you.
Yeah, you really hit on the ethos of what the book is about, right? The world can feel really overwhelming right now. We are in a moment where our climate is in dire straits. We have these incredibly powerful capabilities to do things like edit genetic code or release algorithms that can learn on their own. And to any one of us, Scott and I included, we're in the field of making things and we feel this. It can feel really overwhelming, like all the world is happening to us. But we know that despite all of that unsettlingness, each one of us has the ability and the agency to do a lot of positive for the future that we'd like to build, right? Our technology has the potential for good, but also for harm. And so we wrote the book to call attention to the urgency of the unsettling moment that we're in, and also to pave a path forward that any one of us, no matter if you call yourself a designer or not, can take on.
Carissa, you've said Assembling Tomorrow is, quote, about this runaway design moment that we feel like we're in right now, where the technologies that we're building with are going on to make changes beyond what they were even initially designed for. And it's happening kind of like a runaway train, end quote. I love that image. And not just because it makes me think of one of my favorite films, The Fugitive, starring Harrison Ford, but can you make this concrete for us? You mentioned a couple examples just now, but what's an example of a technology today that's become a kind of runaway train? I think the one that most people can think of is AI, but is there an innocuous seeming one that people may not think to consider?
Another one could be social media, right? It is a technology that I believe had very genuine and benign intent from the start, right? Let's allow people to connect to each other and to be able to send messages to one another. And what we've seen that turn into, though, is that, like, yes, those connections have happened, but also that when you allow people to hyper-connect, we get these second and third order effects of that connection because people become polarized and they start to funnel into just pockets of ideas that reinforce something that they may have explored or that they sort of believe, then they become more extreme. And it's really contributed to the increased polarization of our country, right? But it's also allowed a lot of people to come together and cause great positive change. It's not all good. It's not all bad. But it's a technology that we should be paying attention to.
I feel that's something that we have a hard time, just in general, no matter the topic, grappling with, is that a lot of damage can come from things that are just kind of gray. You explore this in the book about how you can go in with the best intentions and things can still sometimes kind of get messed up, even if you didn't intend them to be. And that even like what seems like a neutral thing can end up having a bad consequence, but it doesn't mean that the person who created it or that even the technology is bad, but it's about grappling with the consequences of the thing that you've made, even if you started from a good place.
Absolutely. I think one of the big takeaways for us is that everything, even if it's working as the creator intended, will break something, right? It will affect some system. It will affect somebody's emotions in ways that you could have just never predicted from the start, because we can never see the whole picture from the beginning.
There was an analogy I heard used by one of the hosts of the Design Better podcast in conversation with both of you, in which he recalled the atomic bomb we dropped on Japan in World War II, and how the moment we did that, we understood its power and the grave consequences of that power. But with technology today, the host said, quote, "It's all optimism and it's absolutely no boundaries," end quote. So, Scott, in your view, why is there this disconnect in Silicon Valley of all places? Why is there a blind spot here?
So the reason things sometimes can go off kilter, even in a place like Silicon Valley, where I do think most people have good intentions, is because when you're working with the technology, when you're the person responsible for bringing it into the world, you get very excited. You get very excited about the potential. And when you're only looking at the potential, you can miss the downsides. You can get so excited about what something can do that you forget to think about what it should do. And really, we're just calling for the ability to look at the whole picture, not just what's possible, but what we want. And not just what we want, but how sometimes the things we make that we want that are desirable also end up causing some problems. So we need to take that into account.
It feels like one of the other things that could potentially lead to something like that, where an unbridled optimism that doesn't take into account the potential ill effects, is when you don't have, let's say, an inclusive workspace. There was a Google I/O presentation, gosh, it was like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, but it's stuck in my mind because I feel like it's a great example of when you design a product, but you don't have the right people, to use a term popular in Silicon Valley, dog fooding it. And I think it was a Google Duo feature. So Google Duo was Google's video conferencing app. But there was this feature in which it was like video calling, kind of like iPhone's FaceTime. But their evolution of it was that you would see video of the person before you accepted the call. And I remember watching the Google I/O thing, and I was, looking at it being like, oh, that's kind of cool. I mean, like, I don't know how much that adds, but I guess that's cool that you can see, your grandma waving to you before you pick up the phone. And I hop on Twitter. Instantly, a lot of the female reporters that I was following in the tech space were instantly flagging this. And they're like, were there any women on the team who created this new feature? Because the first thing that came to their mind was, what if someone calls me and gives me an image that I didn't opt into before I pick up the call? And so it seems like when it comes to designing something with unintended consequences, is that you might not have the right people on the team who could flag something like that.
Yeah, and I did not know that story or that feature. And as you were telling it, I had exactly that reaction of like, oh, that sounds just horrible. Like, on one level, that to me is an example of poor user testing. That feels like something that right away, if you're doing any sort of pre-testing trial of your product, you would notice that fairly early on. We think that things like that are unintended consequences for sure. But some of the much trickier ones to predict are the ones that may take multiple years, even decades, to come to light. The really, easy to grasp onto example of this is like if you think back to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when we're doing all these innovations in our steam engines and our power plants, and we're excited for all the different ways that combustion can help propel us forward and advance society. And like, really, that did cause a lot of incredible progress. When you see the soot and the smoke that comes from that, today we can look back and say, how could they not have known? But then that makes you think, for the technologies that we are currently enamored with, referring to how Scott was talking about how we really get excited about potential. What are the things that we are either oblivious to or choosing not to notice, or are in some way blocked from our field of view that we should be paying attention to? That in another 100 years, somebody's going to look back and say, oh, how could they have not known that? And those are the types of things, too, that we really want to pull into the conversation for makers and for technologists today.
Ray and Charles Eames, the renowned industrial designers who, to quote the Eames Foundation, quote, approached problem solving as an adventure, combining discipline with a sense of play, end quote, are featured in Assembling Tomorrow. And I'm sure everyone at some point has seen their iconic furniture. And I love this quote that you pulled from an interview that Charles gave in 1972. Quote, "The scary fact is that many of our dreams have come true. We wanted a more efficient technology and we got pesticides in the soil. We wanted cars and television sets and appliances, and each of us thought he was the only one wanting that. Our dreams have come true at the expense of Lake Michigan. That doesn't mean that the dreams were all wrong. It means that there was an error somewhere in the wish, and we have to fix it," end quote. And there's so much beauty and poignancy in this quote. Honestly, the first thing that sprung to mind, Scott, as I read it, was the cautionary tale of the monkey's paw, that wishes so often come with unintended, even horrific consequences. And so much of what the two of you do in this book is try and give people the tools they need to try and avoid, or I guess you could say, Scott, at least plan for the monkey paw's consequences.
Absolutely. And I think that quote is so wonderful because it's not a quote that you often hear from the Eameses. Their motto was the best for the most for the least, meaning the best things we can make for the most people possible for the least amount of money on their end. And that is a great idea, right? It's hard to argue with that. I want to give as many people great stuff that doesn't harm their pocketbook as much as possible. Their ideas and their hearts were so true. And then to see Charles is sort of, that was very close to the end of his life, actually, but it was definitely close to the end of his career, to be able to reflect on, wow, we did have good intentions. Like, these are people who had the best of intentions. And then for him to grapple with, and I see that we missed this stuff and it has caused trouble. And I think the question is, how do we more quickly figure out the trouble we're causing and be okay with that? And as a group, deal with it in the design as early as possible, as often as possible, as much as possible.
One point you make in the book is the importance of reasoning from first principles. One way the two of you frame this idea is through the question, when everything goes right, what will go wrong? So, Carissa, what does this question mean from a design standpoint? And I think more importantly for our listeners, how can we integrate it into our own lives as non-designers or as consumers or simply human beings?
This is a question that we actually ask our students that are being interviewed to come to the graduate program in design. And they've made it, these are all very accomplished people. And if you've made it to the interview round, you have a lot of great work to show for yourself already. And you're really proud of that work. And so what we ask students to do is talk us through one of these projects that you've done that holds special significance for you. And tell us how it works. Tell us, how it works today. And wow, if it could be even more successful than it is already, what does that look like, right? And so you could have a student talking about a new type of footwear that helps people that may have had a limp learn to walk again in a way that feels very calming on their hips. Okay, I'm pulling something out here. So, a student could have designed this new piece of footwear. They talk about, oh, wow, it's adopted by every HMO. It becomes something that a doctor can prescribe. It could really become incredibly successful if it was highly used and a lot of people adopted it. Okay, great. You've got this product. And then it's at this moment that you ask that very question that you brought up. So if that happens, if your new footwear device is something that can be prescribed by medical professionals, it can be reimbursed by people's insurers, if all that's going right, what has then gone wrong? Who has that affected? What has that displaced? What that forces you to do is think through how that success, which could be a good thing, could have affected other parties. And if I've got this new kind of footwear that's now reimbursable, maybe that means that there's a decrease in sales for other types of very ergonomic type of shoes. Okay, maybe because these shoes have to be prescribed through a doctor, it means that people start going to their doctors more in order to get them. And that's a positive thing. But then maybe that means that there are too many requests for appointments, right? And there's a shifts to the scheduling of those doctor visits because of it. So the reality is you go on and on like that, where you talk about if this goes really well, it might affect this system in a positive way. It might affect it in a negative way. And to be able to talk through those pros and cons and how they may or may not cascade, that's the idea of if everything goes right, what might actually go wrong.
How do we keep these stories from getting us stuck? If all we wanted to do, like these optimistic students at the Stanford D School, or anyone who's ambitious, who's looking to do something amazing or change the world or just create something beautiful and wonderful that they can share with others. If all we wanted to do was start an online bookstore in the 1990s, and now in 2024, there are employees in some enormous warehouse that are being overworked, or all we wanted to do was design beautiful, affordable chairs and we ended up unintentionally polluting Lake Michigan. If anything, however well-intentioned, at scale, will lead to some bad outcome, how do we stave off the paranoia that would keep us from starting anything in the first place?
It's a perfect question. That is a perfect question. And the answer is we just have to rethink what we get excited about. It's just a different model of what success is. And the students that Carissa is talking about, they come in with a full excitement about being responsible. They want to create something that they're proud of. And when you're thinking about it that way, well, something that I'm proud of, that might be, a big hit product or a lot of money that I make off of my online bookstore or, being a titan of industry. But also it probably means leaving a world that your kids can thrive in, or helping other people, or working the system from end to end. So not only is the product great, but the people who create the product, the workers, are enjoying creating that product. And there are a lot of people who really do have that attitude, and they have a passion and an excitement to do that. Like, it can be equally as exciting to try and create something that's going to be harmonious as it is to create something that's going to be breakthrough and amazing. It's just a slightly different way of looking at it, but the passion and excitement can still be there.
You once said that we live in an age of adorable disruption, in which often the companies and technologies that are causing disruptive social and cultural change have adorable mascots, like that old cartoon Twitter bird, representative of a platform that aided revolution in the Middle East or caused political chaos here at home, or Airbnb's swirly little logo that distracts from the fact that the company is, quote, changing public policy in cities all over the world, end quote. Or Lyft's famous pink mustache belied its mission to disrupt or even disregard decades-old regulations that applied to taxis all over the US. All of these companies, these technologies, so cute, so twee, as they decimate entire industries. What is the relationship here, and this is a question for both of you, between how these companies choose to represent themselves to the public, how they design their outward-facing selves, and how it affects our perception of what they're doing for, but also to us? Scott, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think you've done your research, Michael. That's an old talk. I really appreciate that. So when people are creating these sort of groundbreaking technologies and systems and products, there's an effort to make them palpable, which makes perfect sense, right? They want to attract customers. They want to have a brand that makes people feel cozy and good. The things you mentioned are, ride shares, apartment shares, and communication. Those all want to feel cozy and wonderful to us. But I think what they belie is sort of a surface level understanding of what that means versus a real core, authentic idea that we are trying to create a world that works for us. And we just haven't built the culture up until now, at least in the US, at least in tech companies, that's really about how do we create something that doesn't just disrupt the industry and make a bunch of money for the people who are investing in it, but actually creates a situation that is better, that is more useful to more people, that does help across the whole stack, the whole system. And I do think there's some reason to feel optimistic about that. Even if you take something like Airbnb, which did, disrupt hotels, it's disrupted rental markets, frankly, on the rental market side in ways that I think are pretty damaging to me. There is also a sort of homespun group of people who are able to host other people. It has created like some wonderful experiences, some wonderful connections. So it's not that, disruption is bad. It's just that you can really take the whole thing into account versus just putting a little icing on it.
A lot of these highly tech companies come under some guise of, we want to make life easier. And that easier could be by making it more delightful to find a place to stay, or easy to get the latest information from the people that you want to hear it from. And I think one way that easier happens has to do with data. And I think that this is something that I really want to be at the forefront of the conversation within the culture of these tech organizations, which is around data and data privacy. Because we know that where data pools lies power in the near term and the longer term. So a lot of the cuteness, that sweetness, and the fact that a lot of these organizations have very nice streamlined interfaces, they can do that. They can provide services because they're collecting a lot of information that we, in many times, are freely giving them. We're opting into participating. But in other times, our behaviors are tracked in any number of ways. And we all know that you click on a website and today, at least, you get the warning that, all these different cookies are being used, and you can go through 18 different clicks in the United States to try to opt out of that kind of tracking and information. That's one very specific place where we could both change our policies from a, governmental level, but also individual tech companies could do it too. They could change that culture within them. I took a trip and I was in Europe, and I followed through the series of clicks on a company there to look at the data privacy and information collection. And it's just like an entirely different experience. And I urge anybody that has that to look at it. You can, if you opt into tracking, they tell you exactly which organization they partner with and what information they use and what they use it for, right? And that's like partly law, but then also partly the culture of technology creators in those areas.
Carissa, you're talking about something really important that I've been thinking about a lot. The idea of consent in this day and age, in this transformational age, something that you've both talked about. It feels almost impossible to consent to a lot of the technology and designs that are around us because they're so large and so often come attached with a 100-page legal document. The one that most recently came to mind, there was a recent case in which a husband and wife were at a restaurant in Disney World in Florida. And the woman, she had a food allergy, and she had asked the restaurant, hey, is there anything that could cause an allergic reaction to me in your food? And they said no. She ate the food. She had an allergic reaction. She tragically died. Her husband went to sue Disney, and Disney said, you can't sue us because 4 years prior, you signed up for a free month-long trial of Disney Plus. And in that month-long trial of Disney Plus, you agreed that any lawsuit would be settled in arbitration rather than in court. And so Disney said, your wife died at a restaurant in Disney World, but because you signed up for Disney Plus for a free trial 1 month, 4 years ago, we have to settle this in arbitration. Now, thankfully, this caused such a hubbub, rightfully so, that Disney backed away and said, okay, we will take this to court, even though probably they had good legal footing because of that document 4 years prior that had nothing to do with restaurants. It feels like we're consenting to things all the time, but not really. It feels like in this modern era, we're robbed of actual consent because of all the legal documentation that comes along with your Airbnbs, your Ubers, your Lyfts, your Disney Pluses. How do we navigate this as consumers?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a really sad and tragic story too. I mean, I think the reality is, yes, you can opt out, but it's really hard to. If you don't participate in the online way of living and working and communicating, then you're not living and working and communicating because we rely on those services so much, right? So it is a very, very tricky middle ground space that we're in, right? And you can say, I won't share my data ever, but that also is a blanket statement and a hard one to make because when we share information about ourselves, that allows medical studies to be able to understand what's happening and why different ailments may affect some people and not others, right? So there's incredible positives that come with sharing your data in some places, and also the really scary or detrimental occurrences otherwise. And it's increasingly hard to be able to navigate this as an individual in society today.
Changing gears, can you share with us what apophenia is and how it relates to design and your book?
So apophenia is this phenomenon that I guarantee everybody's experienced. And essentially, it's when you see something that isn't there, but your brain tells you that there's a rabbit in the clouds. You'll look at a power outlet and you see a face in that power outlet. Those are all examples of apophenia. And what that is our brains are hardwired to make patterns and to make story and to make sense of the information around us. This is something that we rely on from birth. Like, this is why babies recognize their parents, right? Because they are able to put together that is a face and that is a friendly face that will feed me. And so these are hard-coded into our survival instincts. But it also means apophenia, you may see patterns that aren't real, right? And if you stare at the clouds long enough, you see things bouncing around. If you stare at a data set or different photographs, if you're paying attention to behaviors, you're trying to make sense of information, if you're doing any type of task that requires synthesis and processing, you're probably trying to look for an insight, an aha moment in the work that you're doing. And every once in a while, you'll get to an epiphany and there's like, oh my goodness, I noticed something. And then a lot of times we're not noticing anything at all, but we need to be in the habit of looking and trying to form new connections between different ideas. Because even though a lot of the times it won't necessarily be real, it might be make-believe, there's some apophenia there, every once in a while we will get to an epiphany. And it's worth knowing that is how we're wired.
How do we learn to distinguish between when we're having real epiphanies and when we're having faux epiphanies, especially from the point of view as a designer, when you're trying to form unique or novel connections between things in order to create something new? How do you train that sense?
Practice and testing. Maybe you've had the experience where you come up with a great idea and you think, oh, wow, this is incredible. And then you find out that like 1,000 other people have tried it before you. And right, and that it's really not real or novel at all, or there's many holes in it. It doesn't work. This is where make a quick mock-up of your idea, draw it out, fold that new phone case out of cardboard and try it out and see how it works. Try it with people. So a lot of active testing of our ideas is what helps us sort the true novelty from the noise.
Yeah, and famously, sometimes something that you think is familiar to everybody or something you think has already been out there is actually completely brand new. Like the Paul McCartney story of how he woke up one morning and he had the tune for Yesterday in his head and he thought that he had heard it on the radio somewhere. So he goes to the other Beatles and he says, hey, and he starts humming the tune without lyrics. He's like, where did we hear this? And they're like, you just came up with that.
I love that. I mean, I think what's worth noting too is that Paul McCartney spent thousands and thousands of hours thinking and playing music, right? And so it's all mulling around in there and you need that background noise to be able to come out with that new tune. Like you need that in your repository in order to come out with the actual song. I give you a challenge, right? Like I hope one of us wakes up one day with that kind of song in our head. But if you're not a musician and actively playing, like you're less apt to come up with a new song.
Before he had the actual lyrics, he had the tune. And so he just came up with gibberish lyrics first. The song originally was just called Scrambled Eggs before he came up with Yesterday.
Oh, wow. I'd love to hear that hummed out.
I would love to hear that. Yeah. I mean, that's an example of testing too, right? And he does that. If you watch that documentary on the Beatles Get Back, he does a lot of like, and then he kind of works out the sound and then puts the lyrics in. And that's like, let me throw this out into the world and figure out from the world whether or not this is working rather than just doing it in my head. So this idea of practice and testing, I think, is right on.
And there's a related quote from the book where you write, quote, people are pretty good at poking holes in other people's faulty stories, but they're lousy at finding weaknesses in their own, end quote. Why do you think that is?
There's some well-documented research that says it's just a quirk in the human brain that once we have a perspective, we tend to look at evidence and see how it fits in that perspective. And if we have an emotional connection to the perspective, meaning if we have a desire for it to be right, then we look at new data coming in and we say, let's say there's data coming in that says I might be wrong. will look at that and say, well, do I really have to believe that? And your brain just naturally does that. And then if there's data that says, reinforces it, says it's going to be right, they're like, how do I believe that? Can I believe that? Is that something I can believe? And I think it's just naturally the way the brain works. One of the big things I think that came out of the writing of this book, there's a quote that we found that talks about how the difference between how people think and the way nature works is sort of the source of all problem. That's where problems come from. But the thing is that we think in a way that is totally incomplete. Think of apophenia. What's that for? It's totally incomplete, but it actually helps us navigate the world. So these shortcuts, once I have a mental model, I'm kind of skeptical of things that disagree with it. That is functional when you're in the wild, because it's better if you have a mental model of a predator to be able to say, oh, that reinforces the mental model. I better get away from the predator. That's actually a useful thing. So our brains do not show us what is. They show us what's useful in navigating an environment that we no longer live in. And so we just have to be aware of that. And a lot of the second half of the book is about techniques, which Carissa coined actionables, that help us see the unseen, help us see the gaps in our understanding, help us see the things that we're missing.
Carissa, you started out as a geologist studying geomorphology. You've described it, quote, the processes that shape the landscape, end quote. What was the journey like going from studying the processes that shape the landscape to co-authoring a book that aims to redefine how we shape the future?
I did start as a geologist studying glaciers and how they slide over rock ridges, and even looking at sand and how sand moves in ripples and sand dunes. And I love science. I love geology. And it sounds very drastic to hop to design from a science. But in reality, I think that we need people pursuing like every tiny slice of truth that is the core of what all these different sciences do. But I found myself very interested in the big picture and how all of the pieces fit together and how we convey information to a broad variety of people. This conveying of information has been a through line for me. And I also love art. I love building and making things. And one thing led to another. And I did find myself pursuing design as a discipline. And at the same time, we are all many things. I think all of us share many identities, whether they're related to career or not. And I try to bring all of mine, including the geology, to my work as a designer. And I think that's worth acknowledging, that all of us have in us all these different lenses to view the world. And that's what's going to build a bright future, is because that intersection of all those lenses.
There was something you said in an interview that actually inspired the first question I asked you both about how you define design. You said in an interview, quote, I didn't know design was a thing until I was working as a geologist, end quote. If we can loop that back to your original description of design, what was that aha moment when you realized design was a thing and what design meant?
When I came through high school and college, design wasn't a discipline that was really talked about that much. And, we didn't have design courses at my school. I took a lot of art in college, but when you're not exposed to something, you don't often even consider it as a possibility. And I think that this is actually really still the case for a lot of students today. And one thing that we've really tried to do in the design degrees at Stanford is to create introductory design experiences for first-year students so that people who, similar to me, may also have grown up not even having considered design as a potential path for them, simply because not everybody takes it like you take math, like you take English. But once you know that it's a possibility, then you start to see it everywhere. And that's a feeling that I had, mostly because I started to pay attention to, oh, wow, absolutely everything has to be made somehow. And then you can't stop seeing it. Right. And so that same aha for me is something that we try to pull into our degrees for students, too, so that they all consider themselves as makers and potential designers.
In that same interview, you said, quote, the people that shape us on our journeys, they do so much more than they ever get credit for. And sometimes they don't even know that one sentence they said was the thing that shifted you, end quote. And I thought this was so beautifully said. and so true. I mean, just thinking about my own life, and it relates so closely to this book, how small choices, conscious or unconscious, can have these huge cascading effects for all of us.
It really can. And people are so important. There's so many people, but I've had 3 mentors throughout my career. And all 3 of these people are geologists, David Rubin, David DeChair, and Rona Cox. And I can remember where I was sitting in a profound conversation with each of them. The exact words I can't tell you right now, but every one of those people have helped shape me. And I'm so appreciative of that. And I try to be that for my students. I know that Scott does the same. And I think we're really lucky to be in those positions where we can help try to be that person for the next generation.
Scott, it's become fairly commonplace for people to dig through someone's Twitter posts from years and years ago. So in 2016, you wrote, quote, "When you do a thing, you can aim to make the most of it, or you can try not to fail at it. Which you choose makes all the difference," end quote. And I really like that, Scott. Can you expand on
it? I'm glad that's the tweet you mentioned, because I have no idea what's in that feed. I haven't been in there for so long, but yes, I can expand on that. Michael, I so appreciate. I mean, it is really an honor to have someone really look into what you've been doing. I mean, thank you so much. It's really an honor.
Of course. It was by design.
Hey. So we work with a guy over at the business school named Baba Shiv, and he has a model that he uses, which is a type 1 and type 2 mindset. A type 1 mindset is this avoidance of failure. So contingency planning, you might think of as a goalie. A type 2 mindset is sort of the fear of missing out, not wanting to miss out on some potential. And you can think of that as if you watch soccer or football, the striker. This is the person who's trying to capitalize on the opportunities that are created. And it's not that either is better or worse. It's not that one is more important than the other. It's that you need to do both. And when you go into a situation just trying not to fail, you're really looking at everything that could go wrong. And that's incredibly useful when you're in crisis. But when you're not in crisis, it can actually get in the way of seeing opportunity, of finding something that might be a way to make something better that's going unsaid or not seen. And so when you get into that type 2 mindset, which is really just trying to find potential and see what you can do with it, it allows you some hope, even in difficult situations, and it changes the outcomes. If you're enthusiastic, Kevin Kelly, who's sort of a longtime technologist out in this neck of the woods, talks about enthusiasm is worth 25 IQ points.
I love that.
It's so true, too. I mean, when I'm excited and in a good mood, I'm much more sharp.
I imagine that has to be something that you discuss with your students about how your frame of mind, your emotional state can affect what you're able to achieve.
The way I frame it is, I started my career in film, so I do a lot of listening to podcasts with filmmakers. And oftentimes it's a critic speaking to the person who makes the film. And the critic will say something like, "Oh, when you did this, it reminded me of this other movie that you did, and I think your intention was this." And almost invariably, the filmmaker will say, "Yeah, I guess you're right, but I was just trying to finish the shot before the sun went down, And then when they just open it up for questions for the filmmaker, they go on and on about their influences. "Oh, I got this idea from this and I love this. And oh, this thing was so great." And what it made me think about is how people who make things and make things well, they do it from a place of excitement and love and appreciation. You just notice and you want to reproduce what's good in the world. And the people who are very good at making sense of things, they often look at things from a skepticism and a critique and, a little bit more of a distant eye and less appreciation and more skepticism. Again, both are really necessary, but there is something about appreciation that I think is a superpower. And I really try to give my students permission to appreciate. Because a lot of times, if you go through high school in the United States, appreciation is not appreciated. I grew up outside of Boston, Carissa too. if I said I liked something and somebody else thought it was the least bit different, I would just be ridiculed for hours, you know? And there's just not a support for that type of appreciation. It's vulnerable and risky in American culture. But I want my students to be able to take that back and really fall in love with the things they love and really identify what they love about them. And then that becomes replicated in the world.
While we're on Twitter, Scott, I would be remiss if I didn't quote you one more time, also from 2016, in which you wrote, quote, "My job as a parent is not to teach my kids, but to help them discover," end quote. What's the difference between teaching someone and helping them discover something? And how, if at all, does your role as a parent and your role as a creative director and instructor at Stanford D School intersect?
Again, such a great question. So I remember exactly what that was that I was referring to there. There's a woman who was a movie star in the 1930s and also an inventor. She invented some of the core technology that is beneath Wi-Fi. It is a long story, but it's a very interesting sort of switching technology that allows Wi-Fi to stay connected and be encrypted. And I was like, how did she become this person who's a movie star / inventor? That is so fascinating. And I had read that her dad would sort of explain everything around her. So just how everything was made, anything they saw. And so I started adopting this habit with my kids. And I remember we were driving down a street and I was trying to explain, I think it was like how a backhoe worked. And they just didn't care. There was no, they were thinking about something else. And I just realized, oh yeah, my job is not to tell them what I know. It's to help them figure out what they need to know. And so I started changing my posture and just sort of following, like, what are they interested in? And how can I help them get to the next level of interest or figure out how that thing works? And it sort of became what the ultimate thing is about being a parent, which is realizing it's not about you, but that you are present for this very special moment, which is the growth of another human being. You know what I mean? Growth both physically and emotionally and in terms of intellect. And just being present for that is enough. It just like really twisted my idea of parenting.
There was a quote from a Stanford graduate from the class of 2003. And the quote said, "College is about building a great human, intellectually and emotionally, and answering the question, who do I want to be?" End quote. And it feels like, Scott, from what you've just said, that that's what parenting is too. It's building or helping to build a great human and helping them discover who they want to be.
Yeah, I think that's what it all is. I think in our culture and the way I kind of came up, it was sort of about proving yourself. And that felt like where impact comes from. Like impact comes from the things that I put into the world. And of course, that's very true. I'm not saying that's not true. But as a teacher, as a parent, maybe just as I get older, I can see that, there's so much more impact in sort of helping the world work, just participating in the ongoing narrative of this life that's unfolding around us. And just being around to help guide it in ways that might be more beneficial for what's to come.
So now I want to touch on where that quote was pulled from. There was a year-long project that you undertook back in 2015 called Stanford 2025, in which you imagined what living and learning on the Stanford campus would look like a year from now, considering now is 2024.
I know, it's amazing to think about.
And that quote was from a talk you gave that same year in 2015, about that project. And in that talk, you said, quote, "Our job is to prepare students for a future that we're not prepared for ourselves," end quote. And so this is a question for both of you, but I want to put it to you first, Scott. Looking back over the nearly 10 years since you gave that talk, since your Stanford 2025 project, what do you know now in 2024 that you were not yet prepared for, both in your capacity at Stanford and as a human?
Great question. First of all, a bit on that project. Carissa and I actually led that project together with our executive director, Sarah Stein Greenberg. So big group effort over at the D School. And the idea was to look at where things were going and figure out what's the need and what are the features of an on-campus experience, not just at that point, everything was sort of thinking it would move online into, these massive online courses. And, that still may be to come, but hasn't proven true quite as much. I think the thing that quote really gets to, which is our job is to prepare students for a world that we don't even know what is going to bring, is that I feel like that's just gotten even more true. I think I'm kind of surprised at the degree to which the world continues to surprise, whether it's the pandemic or what's going on with politics or climate change or generative AI being such a strange sort of technology that can think for us and create for us using our data to do it. It's just surprising to me how unknown the future really is. So to some degree, I think this has been a humbling decade. And I think that's okay. There's some vision of designers that comes from this sort of old school rock star designer type model where, designers are full of hubris and they want to, make their mark on the world. I find design to be the most humbling activity ever because you're constantly confronted with what you don't know, assumptions you made that aren't working. But I find that's also extremely empowering because you kind of relinquish the need to know everything and get more excited about the ability to discover. And just having that ability and honing that ability to discover, I think has probably been the biggest learning for me over the last 10 years.
Carissa?
Yeah, in 2014, 2025 did feel like a ways off.
Yes, it did.
That in itself is wrinkle-inducing. In that project, we created 4 parallel futures. Within each of these futures, we talked about different technologies and behaviors and practices that would be possible and common in the year 2025. One thing, though, thinking back, that I don't think we included, because we included a ton of things that I feel like have come true, I don't think we talked that much about mental health. And that has really been a part of what learning experiences need to take into account now. Not that there weren't mental health issues 10 or more years ago. I think it's actually a positive that we're now talking about them and they're part of the conversation. But being able to acknowledge that a student, a learner, is a whole person and not just showing up with their quote unquote academic hat has been a big shift. And that is definitely surprising to me as an educator, mostly because it feels very prominent right now. Not that I'm surprised that it exists, but I do think that the accelerating technology, the speed at which sharing happens, the speed of change can contribute to feeling like you're never enough, that you can never keep up. And so that really has happened really quickly.
Carissa, you've written, quote, "Surprise is one of the most beautiful emotions," end quote. And I would love for you to expand on that, both in how it relates to the world of design and also life in general.
Yeah, I think I wrote that actually fairly recently when Scott and I gave a book talk together. This was an in-person talk, and a friend of mine who is a close friend, actually, she's the woman that married me and my husband 15 plus years ago. She just showed up there. It was 100% surprise. When a person surprises you and there's that emotion behind it, it's almost like nothing else matters. Like you realize, oh, this is what I value all along, over all else. Right? It's just being able to see my friend is so much more important than I'm going to look slightly awkward in this shirt. I wish I had worn a different one. Right? It puts a lot of those things that can cloud our everyday into perspective. And, happy surprise can be quite beautiful and delightful for that reason.
It really can be. I think the best way that I could end this conversation is to actually pull from something you said a little bit earlier, Scott, and pose this question to both of you. I want to loop back to something you said. You want to reproduce what's good in the world. And so I want to pose this question to each of you. We'll start with you, Carissa. What is something good in the world that you've encountered either decades ago or yesterday that you want to reproduce?
A good thing that I see as an educator, as a parent, is that society and our education system is getting better at recognizing and teaching to many different learning styles. Whereas when I grew up, it was really about you first learn to read and then you read to learn. I think that we're acknowledging now, we have this awareness of this broad neurodiversity that each one of us has, even if you can exist in a traditional education system. I think I'm excited for the next wave of how we're going to teach to our very neurodivergent selves, all of us, and those of us that live in one pocket of a spectrum, and how we can really make space for the incredible contributions we're going to get from people who may not thrive in a traditional school system, but see the world in such unique ways that they notice things the rest of us can't.
And Scott, how about you?
So many things, and it's such a great question. Two things came to mind. One is we reference a bunch of architects in the book, and I think there's so many people doing such wonderful things with architecture. So two examples. One is an architect named Francis Kéré, who works in Burkina Faso, where he's from, but he lives in Germany now. And he creates schools and hospitals, and the way that he does it is by using local materials. He creates these wonderful, unique designs, but uses local materials and has the people there learn how to build the building as the building is being built. So he not only leaves behind a nice building, but he leaves behind the knowledge of how to build it. And just that as a metaphor, the ability to, whatever I'm doing, not just create the thing, but also leave behind the knowledge of creating it. And then I would say the other thing is I just am a real big believer in make-believe. When someone tells a wonderful story or creates something that just seems to come out of nowhere, I so admire that. And it just delights me to no end. And so I think I want to continue to create sort of delightful make-believe in all kinds of ways, whether that's a story or it's an idea that people can get behind. Just this ability to imagine what doesn't yet exist is something I'm constantly learning how to do.
Scott and Carissa, it's been such a pleasure to speak with both of you today. And reading your book and learning more about the two of you, I'm so glad that it's you who are instructing and empowering the next generation of designers to not only design beautiful things that can do good in the world, but also showing them, importantly, also how, to use a phrase of yours, pick up the pieces when something breaks. Thank you both for your work. And today, thank you both for your time.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Michael.